And we're live. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another Stripe Dev Chats. My name is Cecil Phillip. And today we have a really special episode. We're going to be talking to our friend Thor here, who's from the Superbase team. And you can let us know a little bit about how we could build Stripe integrations with Superbase, how we could use Superbase as our backend as a service. So I've never used Superbase before, but I've heard so much about it. The community really loves it. So I'm really excited to learn a lot more about how this product works. But before we do that, like Thor, why don't we just get a really quick introduction? Why don't you tell folks a little bit about who you are and what do you do?
Yeah, thanks so much, Cecil. It's great to be back on this YouTube channel. Some of you might recognize me. I used to do videos on here about, payments, mobile payments. Yeah, I think the last videos I did was about like React Native, and that was really fun. So yeah, I used to work at Stripe, actually same team as Cecil, developer relations. Was actually at Stripe for a very long time, I think almost 6 years, which was great. Very fond memories. And so it's really good to be back. Nowadays, I'm with Supabase. We build backend infrastructure, database infrastructure, and very much with an open source mandate. So our tagline is kind of the, open source Firebase alternative. And that very much stems from kind of the admiration we have for the Firebase developer experience. And we're kind of trying to bring that to open source tools. So we're built on top of Postgres. Postgres is kind of the open source database, relational database that underpins kind of the whole Supabase stack. And then on top of it, we have a bunch of different services that allow you to do authentication, unstructured storage like file storage, real-time subscriptions, edge functions, and now most recently Vector database as well. So yeah, that's me. That's Superbase, and thanks so much for having me.
Awesome. And you're right. Like I do remember going through the Stripe YouTube lists of things and seeing, I'm like, oh, hey, who's this Thor guy? That's it here. So definitely glad that you're back. I'm sure everyone is super happy to see you. So definitely appreciate you making some time to come here and hang out with us. First question I want to ask you. So for people that are not familiar with Firebase or Superbase either, like who is this for? Like what types of developers is this product kind of targeting?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, I feel like it's quite similar to Stripe in that sense, where really, Stripe was built for kind of the in the early days at least for the indie hackers, for the solo entrepreneurs, the technical entrepreneurs, and really like a deep focus on developer experience and basically with that kind of winning over the heart of the individual developer, and eventually kind of using that as a way to sort of get the door into the enterprise ecosystem, because enterprise companies are also just made up of a collection of individual developers, and if they love your tool, they kind of become your internal champions. And I think in that sense, very similar to Stripe, where it's really focusing on the developer experience, really focusing on kind of nailing that for the individual developer, and with that kind of get the foot in the door, and ideally kind of scale with these smaller projects through to potentially the enterprise in the end. So the infrastructure is scalable to the enterprise level, and that really is kind of the idea. Basically, make sort of this enterprise grade tooling more accessible to a broader audience of developers. And yeah, some people might be familiar with Postgres. It's really, really powerful, but it kind of comes with a bunch of hurdles, and so we're kind of trying to break these down, make them more accessible to kind of a broader audience of developers. That might be web developers, front developers, full stack developers, mobile developers. So yeah, kind of like that.
Okay, so then I can imagine if I have a project, right? Let's say I'm building a mobile app, right? And all of the things that we would need for an application. We need storage, obviously. We need auth, probably some level of like logging or metrics or something like that, like something to store those types of things. And then some back end API, right? Some function that I could run, whether it's serverless or an API endpoint or something like that, right? Those are the things that I kind of think about as I'm building like an app. Like, and it doesn't even have to be a mobile app. It could be a web app, web application, or whatever the case is. But on its core, like those are the things that I could think about that I would need. And so when I look at like the product offerings from Superbase, it kind of looks like it covers all of that and a little bit more too. But like it looks like it covers all of those bases, right? So it seems like a very good starting point to say, hey, I want to build a thing. Here's my infrastructure, kind of not really pre-packaged, but like pre-assembled, and I could like tweak it and update it, or I could use the pieces that I want, right? And now I have like a jump start to like being productive and getting my work done. Is that like a fair synopsis of that?
Yeah, exactly that. And I mean, the idea isn't new, right? Like you had these services, like you might remember Parse. I think in my sort of post-university days, I was kind of building things on Parse. I remember I wanted to build this like food ordering sort of point of sales system. That was when I first heard about Stripe, and heard about Parse and kind of started building with that. And so really sort of this idea of backend infrastructure as a service is definitely not new, but kind of what we're trying to do is really have the entire stack open source, and then more importantly as well, have kind of all the different components be sort of valuable on its own. So you can take every part of the Supabase stack and run it on its own. You can use only auth, for example, if you wanted to. You could only use edge functions. And then also you can take these and run them on your own infrastructure should you wish to. So that's kind of our philosophy: open source, sort of pluggable, portable, self-hostable, but basically everything intercompatible, if that's the right word. So everything is useful on its own, but if you put it together, it becomes really powerful.
Okay. So if I was supposed to start using Superbase today, like what are the things that I need? And like what is it kind of built on, right? Because so for me, I'm a .NET developer, but I know other languages too. And then I work with a lot of folks that do Ruby. I work with folks that do Go, with Java. You know what I mean? Like, can all of us use Superbase? Is this like a thing that everyone can play with, or do I have to know like a certain language or a certain framework or whatever, like, to get started with it?
Yeah, no, that's exactly the idea. So we're giving you the database, which is just a full, non-forked version of Postgres. So it is just Postgres, and we give you that. So if you actually want, say Heroku shut down, right, and you had some project on there, say you had like a Ruby on Rails project, you could actually just run that on Supabase. So we give you the full Postgres connection string, so you can only just use the database should you wish to. But then what we also do is we basically auto-generate an API on top of Postgres. And that's a really, really cool open source project called Postgres, so REST, which actually gives you a serverless, scalable API. And so the connection pooling and kind of all the stuff that you normally need to worry about is like, exhausting database connections and sort of how does that stuff work. You don't have to worry about. If you use the serverless API, you can literally just use REST. You can use GraphQL as well. So we have a database extension as well as a GraphQL engine kind of in the database that also is running through that API. So you can use your REST API, your GraphQL API. And so that is kind of the beauty, that you can actually communicate with the database from kind of any system. So, desktop application, any kind of server-side scripting language, but then also the new kind of, edge functions, sort of serverless environments, right? These are oftentimes a bit more complicated because you kind of have these, isolates running like all over the world, spinning up, separate connections. And so having something like the serverless API that you can connect to just over REST is quite useful. So yeah, I think pretty much anything you use pretty much any environment, as long as it can talk, HTTP,
Yeah.
you can talk to the database, which also makes it, nice for. So if you're building a mobile app, right, you generally don't have a server-side environment, right, because you're installing kind of the app directly on the user's end device. So in that case, it's great that you can directly from the client side, you can talk to the database. So that's very similar to like the Firebase approach, where your client application can talk
Mm.
directly to the database using kind of the client SDKs.
Okay. So I know recently like there's been a lot of talk about like no code development and or low code infrastructure and those types of things. I guess with the exception of edge functions, because I'm going to assume edge functions you need to write code, right? With the exception of edge functions, like there's a lot of other services that are in here that you all have, right? Like there's storage, there's real time, there's the vector stuff, there's the auth stuff. Do I have to write code on the back end, not in my front end, but like, is there like a lot of coding in the back end to set that stuff up? Or would you say like most of the code that needs to be written is from the consuming side and not actually like in Superbase to like set it up itself?
Yeah, that's exactly it. So basically, most of the code that's written is kind of in your client application. And you actually have a lot of projects. So we have a partners page. Actually, if you go supabase.com/partners,
Okay.
there's a bunch of really, really cool no code, low code tools that actually integrate with Supabase. There's things like Bubble. I think Bubble's become very popular in kind of the web no code community. So for like building websites, there's Flutter Flow for building mobile apps as kind of a no code environment. And then there's tons of kind of other services.
Okay.
And yeah, I mean, the beauty as well is if you know JavaScript, for example, you can use, for example, Supervised JS is kind of our JavaScript SDK. If you're familiar with something like Nex, Nex is kind of a SQL sort of query builder. It's somewhat similar to that, but it is kind of fully typed. So you can actually generate TypeScript types from the database schema kind of automatically
nice.
using the Superbase CLI. And then you can basically just inject the types into your Superbase JS client, and you get a really, really nice experience there. And then, I mean, again, as well, since it is purely Postgres, there's a ton of like cool tools and ORMs actually out there. There's Prisma, which a lot of developers really, really love. I think recently Drizzle ORM has been coming out more and more. So
Okay.
yeah, there's a very rich environment, which is why we love Postgres so much. Like kind of going all in on Postgres is almost like cheating, kind of like using a cheat code, because it is just so powerful. And the whole ecosystem of sort of on the backend side of things, the database side of things, the amount of extensions that there are for Postgres are just really, really cool. And then as well, kind of on the client side and the different ORMs, the different community tools. So
Yeah.
that's what I personally really love about Postgres. Postgres and Supabase is sort of building this. I like to call it kind of a community of communities, because there's just so many different kind of communities that come together and use this tool, and that's really cool.
That's awesome. So Thor, I think what I want to do, I'm going to bring up your screen really quickly, and maybe we could just kind of like walk through some things and then just kind of talk about, like I kind of want to dive into some of those very specific components that actually like make up Superbase. And the thing is, as I'm looking at your website, so your screen is up right now. As I'm looking at the Superbase site, right? Like if you go to like that product section, again, like there's just so many things in there, right? So you got database, you got auth, you got storage. I'm guessing the difference between database and storage is, I'm guessing storage is key value. Would that be correct? That's like a key value storage, and the database is like a remote.
No, so
like you said, it's
storage is actually file storage, so unstructured. data. So we don't have a KV at the moment.
Okay.
We're working on KV. So for edge functions, we're using Dino, also a really, really awesome open source project. And so Dino KV recently came out. So that is something that we want to enable for the hosted infrastructure as well, where you can basically have the edge key value store as kind of potentially a caching layer, or for things like rate limiting. Like things like rate limiting, you wouldn't use a Postgres database, right? There are certain use cases that you like a counter or rate limiting that you wouldn't use Postgres. And then that's where something like an edge KV comes in really handy. But no, so storage is specifically file storage. And the file storage component is actually hosted on S3 at the moment. So in a way, it's kind of an sort of an integration layer for S3. But the nice thing is that all of these components, so storage basically writes all the metadata into the Postgres database, which then means we can also use authentication to write access rules for our files. And so this is where kind of this whole interconnectedness comes together, where sort of all the different components put together become so powerful, which is really, really nice.
Nice. All right. So we got the database, we got storage, right? And like you said, like the storage is more so like a wrapper over S3, and then the database is Postgres, like raw Postgres. I had a question about the edge functions. I'm gonna guess that's kind of like a serverless type experience, right? Like, is there anything we need to know about writing these edge functions? Like, are there any limitations? Like, how do they scale? I know cold start is always a thing when people talk about serverless. Like how does Superbase like deal with some of those types of things?
Yeah, that's a good point. And there's actually a good amount of blog posts on sort of our the choices we made for edge functions. I think the hardest choice was actually we were like, there's so many providers out there that do edge functions and like serverless functions really, really well. Like, why should we do this, right? But users kept asking for it. They were like, I want edge functions. And we're like trying to figure out, okay, what does this mean? Like, why do people want edge functions, right? Like if you're working with something like Vercel or Netlify, like you have your, serverless functions in there. But then actually the biggest use case that we found, so when we asked our users, was payments. So like mobile developers, for example, they don't have kind of existing, edge function environments. And when they want to accept payments, they need a secure server-side environment to create their payment request objects, right? To process their payments. And so they were like, yeah, actually, we want to use Stripe. Like, give us serverless, functions. And we're like, okay. And then we actually went and like looked at, okay, what can we do? It doesn't really make sense to just like use Lambda because we want everything to be open source. And so we evaluated a couple different things. And in the end, we chose to use Dino. So Dino is a JavaScript runtime. It's built by the folks that, originally kind of built Node as well. And so basically now building kind of Dino with, the learnings of sort of building Node and kind of trying to avoid some of the things that went wrong. They believe went wrong there. Now with Dino, there is still a bit of a learning curve sometimes, like setting up your environment correctly. We do have a lot of documentation on it. There's extensions for VS Code and like getting that all working. But I think like if you haven't been working with Dino before, that is a bit of a point of friction that we're trying to iron out. But like once you actually sort of get up to speed with Dino, it is really, really nice. And now, like if I'm building like a little chat bot, a little Telegram bot or what have you, like for me, I just spin up an edge function. If I need a webhook handler or something, just spin up a little edge function and And that's great. And so here we're working with Dino Deploy at the moment, where they then deploy the functions in like 29 regions globally. And so these functions are V8 isolates. It basically just means it's kind of a spec down version of kind of the
V8 engine
JavaScript runtime. And so they can boot up really, really quickly. And so that's where you can like distribute it around the world, the code. And basically the closer it is to your user, the faster then response times they get. Obviously, then if your edge function talks to your database, it also becomes important, like where your database is located and things like that. But generally, it is very scalable. It is the cold boot times are pretty quick, depending on what you do, right? Like some things, like Puppeteer, for example, is like a very big dependency. That's something you wouldn't be able to run kind of in an edge function.
Sure.
But then you would use something like Browserless, for example, to kind of get access to like a outsourced Puppeteer environment or something like that. But so I think there's still some hurdles, still a lot of work to do. But it allows you to process payments, which was kind of a big win for users. And so that's quite handy.
So we have a couple of questions coming in from the chat that I wanted to get to. So first one, and I think this one is in relation to what you're talking about in edge functions, is our friend Tim Manning over on YouTube is asking, does Superbase support GraphQL? And I'm guessing that would be through the edge functionality, right? So can I do GraphQL endpoints inside of here?
Yes. So you actually don't have to use edge functions for this. So we have a GraphQL engine. It's called PG GraphQL, built into the database, actually. So PG GraphQL is a GraphQL extension, and it was built by one of our awesome team members, Ollie. Ollie was basically like, hey, maybe we can actually just translate GraphQL queries like right in the database as an extension. And so he just started working on that. And so we're now actually hosting for you PG GraphQL, which works together with Postgres to actually give you GraphQL API out of the box. So any hosted Supabase project, you actually have a GraphQL API built in. So the difference here is that because this basically the query translation layer is in the database. For example, what you can't do is something like schema stitching, right? If you have providers, I think there was like one out there, One Graph, I think it was called, that was sort of the idea that you basically have a universal endpoint for like all your different services, right? Like even if you want to talk to Stripe, you basically just connect Stripe to your, to your kind of backend middleware. And then you just have one GraphQL endpoint to talk to all your different services. So that's something that's currently not possible, although we're working on something that's called Supervised wrappers, again, an extension, which actually allows you to query via SQL external services. So Supervised wrappers, very interesting project as well, built in Rust. So it uses this concept of Postgres foreign data wrappers, which is sort of a native thing built into Postgres. And we actually have it for, I think, Stripe at the moment, BigQuery, ClickHouse, Firebase, even Airtable S3, basically allowing you to use SQL to access kind of all these external services.
Oh, that's cool.
And so once that is kind of all hooked up, you can actually then use GraphQL to sort of use the foreign data wrappers as well, I believe. But yeah, it is a bit of a futuristic thing still. So if you need something that is like really robust at the moment, kind of in this sort of GraphQL world where you have your schema stitching and all of that, then probably not the right choice for you just yet. But it is a very interesting concept that the team is working on. Yeah,
that's very cool. And like you said, this is an extension, so you don't have it by default, but it's something that you could just install and import into your project, and then obviously wire it up and start using it.
Correct. Yeah, and so actually with the hosted service, we give you a bunch of extensions kind of out of the box.
Oh, really?
So maybe if I go to, this is my Next.js subscription payments project here. This is the demo project. Actually has a good amount of traffic, even though it is just demo. But then you can go, let me maybe zoom in a bit. Can folks see this? If you go to database, we have extensions. And so we have a bunch of extensions that we basically pre-install for any hosted project. And then there's a bunch of available extensions as well that you can use. And then something that's really interesting as well. So that's the cool thing. There's a lot of experimental stuff going on. The team is actually building basically a package manager for Postgres.
No way! That's crazy.
Yeah. So it's similar to like NPM, right? But basically, I mean, I don't know the exact details of kind of the issues, but there is like obviously there's security concerns with like just installing any kind of crazy extension in your database. But there's sort of this concept of, I think we're working on this with AWS, where they are building kind of a framework for building trusted language extensions. And what that means, it's sort of a lockdown environment where you can take away some of these security concerns. And so basically then the database manager will use kind of these trusted language extensions. And so as long as your extension is built kind of with this framework, we can then like securely install it kind of in your database.
That is crazy.
Funnily enough, actually, this was sort of the original idea that Koppel, one of our founders, pitched to Ant, one of our co-founders. Well, they are the two founders. So that is actually the original idea he pitched as like, oh, this is what we can build, and like this is what can get us into like Y Combinator. So it's funny now how like now the original idea is sort of starting to actually get visited. But cool. So a lot of exciting kind of open source work happening. And I think the great thing with open source as well is just it attracts a lot of smart people, and it actually is a really, really great driver in terms of talent. We rarely need to look for talent because they find these interesting projects and start contributing and somehow then eventually end up becoming part of Supabase. Open source has been actually a really, really nice factor for us, funnily enough, in the context of hiring. Yeah,
that's beautiful. So like through open source, right? So folks making contributions and just finding work that they're interested in, they've now have like job opportunities, right? Which is amazing. I love that.
Yeah.
One other question I want to jump into before we keep going. This one also coming in from YouTube. SaaS using Superbase. So can you build SaaSes on Superbase? I'm going to guess the answer is yes, but let me see if you have like a more detailed explanation for that.
Yes. We even have a nice little starter kit for this. So funnily enough, this is actually how my journey at Supabase started, is exactly this project. So when I first learned about Supabase, I was working at Stripe. And initially, so the founders kind of reached out to like get feedback on, kind of what they were working on. And they actually came into the Stripe office for lunch here in Singapore. And we like sat down, pitched me this, thing, kind of told me about it. And I was like, kind of sounds like Prisma, but just with a lot more SQL. And I was like, like front-end developers will not like this. This is a stupid idea. And I was like, I did look further into it at that point. Also, I just had moved to Singapore at that point, so a lot of different things were going on. Then eventually COVID hit. And after kind of the COVID lockdown was over, we met again for coffee. And they were like, oh, we just added Auth. So they just added the Auth service kind of to the Supabase stack at that point. And I was like, oh, this is interesting, right? Because like working at Stripe, we know like Stripe makes it really, really easy for you to process payments. You can create a customer object and you can charge it like super easily. But it is actually on you to figure out that the person who's logged in is actually this customer, right? So this like authentication, authorization concept, Stripe doesn't actually help you a little bit more nowadays with like a bunch of the hosted services, right? Like the customer portal and such. But still, like back then you really had to kind of work your auth. You had to figure that out yourself. And so I was like, okay, this is interesting. Let me actually play around with this. Let me build like a little kind of customer management sort of backend. And so I did that, and I was like, oh, this was actually the easiest auth I've ever implemented myself. And like from that point on, I was hooked, and then actually started contributing. And so this was the first thing I worked on back then at Stripe. Actually, was this subscription payment starter, where it's like, yes, a lot of Stripe users actually struggle with how do I authenticate my customer, and actually do this mapping of like, logged in customer, what is their customer ID, how do I charge their credit card. And so I built this template, and you can actually see here we have like the schema.sql file. So basically what we have is we have kind of this user table, which kind of just stores some information about the user. But then also we have this customers table, and basically this customer table is just the mapping of our auth, Supabase auth user to like a Stripe customer ID. And that is kind of sort of the crucial concept of unlocking that mapping of like, okay, my customer who's signed in, my user who's signed in, what is their customer ID? How can I make sure I charge the correct credit card? And so, I built this subscription payment starter. Actually has like a crazy amount of stars. So
over 3,000 stars, 3.4 thousand stars.
And what I love as well is a lot of people are actually using it. And I think like I've seen it out in the wild recently on some like AI projects. And I was like, oh, this is, this is actually using the template. And then I was like, oh, damn it, I should have actually built a business with this. But it's really, really cool to see this like enabling folks to actually build like businesses. Yeah.
That's awesome. And this is using Next.js, like you said. So like there's a little bit of Next.js, there's some Superbase, there's some Stripe in there. And so now essentially like this template shows people how to take all these different worlds together. And you're like, hey, I want to build a subscription web application. I want to build a subscription product, whatever it is, right? Maybe I have like, what do you call those things? Like subscription boxes, right? When they send you those boxes every month with like random stuff. I want to build a subscription box business. Here's like a good chunk of that code already written. Now I just have to add in like my particular business logic, my particular products, my branding, my like the things that are unique to me. But in terms of like the core aspects of it, like you already have that in this template, right? So now I can imagine folks being like, oh, wow, great. I don't have to do a bunch of work. I could just grab Thor's template and then start using it.
Yeah. And that was exactly the intention. Make it easier for folks to like, build kind of SaaS businesses. And so basically the great thing with SaaS is it is a very kind of predictable, repeatable business model. And so, you generally have kind of this like monthly, yearly sort of billing thing. You have pricing plans. you need a way for folks to like sign in. And so we actually eventually built, it currently is just a React component. We call it Auth UI. So we have this kind of Auth UI, which supports like different OAuth login providers. So for example, I can kind of sign in with my GitHub here. And then when I'm signed in, I can then basically choose like, okay, which plan do I want? Kind of want the startup plan. Can click subscribe here. And then what in the background happens is, I get my checkout session created. We're using kind of the hosted payment pages here. I don't have my 4242. I used to have this text expander kind of snippet.
Nice.
But I don't have it anymore.
But this is just like like you said, like that hosted Stripe checkout page. But this is already built into your, it's already built into your template, right? So folks don't even really have to worry about it that much. More so just set up your Stripe account, add your keys, and then we're done, right? Like it's kind of just wired up or ready to go.
Yeah. And the big part here as well is kind of the webhook handling, right? When you're using something like subscriptions, you really need kind of that webhook handling. And so that was kind of a big crucial factor here, where we basically have like, our API routes, our webhooks. And so like for anything like where we're creating products, sort of changing product information, prices, and like all our subscription events are being sent to like our Vercel or Netlify if we deploy our project there. And then what it actually does is it passes the webhook and it sends a request to Supabase to update the subscription information. And then we're actually using the subscription information. If we're looking into the schema, so we have this concept of role level security policies, which, if you're familiar with like Firebase, because you're directly allowing access from the client side to the database, you need some mechanism of writing security rules. And Postgres actually has this built in using something called role level security policies. And so we can write these policies here in plain SQL, where we can say, okay, the user can view their own data. And then we have a JWT that is kind of attached to every request. And we're basically just checking, okay, so auth.uid is a database function that extracts the user ID from the JWT for this request. And we're just checking that this user ID is the same as the ID here in our users table. And then basically what Postgres does, it pre-filters all the data based on these rules. So making sure that we can only, restrict access to the data based on like which user is logged in. And so this is the cool thing where, we can basically then actually write our queries as like select star. So select everything, but based on the JWT, we actually only get the data that we're allowed to see kind of based on this pre-filter. And yeah, so it is sometimes a bit difficult to understand the policies, kind of, we're trying to make that sort of easier.
Sure.
But I think I also had like, if I remember, I had like a branch where it was like a simple paywall. And so you can actually take these policies pretty far, where you can say like, where was it? I think, was it here? So you can like create a policy where you can say allow access based on subscription status. And then basically you can sort of within the policy, you can check, okay, for the logged in user, is the subscription status trialing or active? And only in that case, give them access to the data. So you can take these like RLS policies pretty far, but yeah, in most scenarios, you kind of need a way to sort of restrict access to the data, especially if you're communicating with it directly from the client side to the database. And so that's where kind of the auth, with the JWT plays together with the database and makes that happen.
Nice. So question then. So like you're showing us how the JWTs and the tokens work in like the Superbase context. What if I had my own auth already? Like, is that something that I could plug in? Like, what if I'm using auth 0? What if I'm using something on premise like, I don't know, LDAP or Active Directory or like some of these more enterprisey things, right? Like, can I use those as well, or am I just have to use this one?
Yes, no. So that's a great thing because it is just a standard JWT. Like as long as you have a mechanism to basically issue a JWT, you can pretty much bring whatever auth you want. And actually, if you look into our supabase.com/partners, we actually have a bunch of like auth providers that are like integrated with Supabase. So, say you prefer, you're using Next.js already, Next Auth, you can do that. Clerk is a very popular one, especially for Next.js or anything React related. Like their drop-in React component for auth is really, really good. That's like they've nailed that. So if that's something you want, you can use that. And so basically the way it works is you have a JWT secret. I just need to find was it here? JWT secret, and you're basically, so, using something like JSON Web Token, JWT, you then basically what you do is you create an access token where you encode the payload, which is basically the user ID from your auth 0 service. So, or from any service you're using, you kind of constructing a payload, and then you're signing it as a JWT, and attaching that to the request to Supabase. And so then it works like downstream. It works the same. As long as you can do that, and the database has a way to basically extract the user ID from the JWT, then it just all works together.
Nice. So Thor, we're getting close to the end of the show, and I have some questions I want to ask you.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you could talk to us about regarding like future features that you're working on when it comes to Superbase? Anything that you could talk about publicly, like new options, new products that you're adding, maybe a roadmap or anything of the sort? Like if I've seen this and I'm like, okay, wow, Superbase is awesome. Like, do you have like your one more thing moment where you're like, oh, but this is coming too?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we actually just launched it, but so maybe folks might have not heard of it, and so that's Supervised Vector.
Oh, nice.
And right now, with like the AI movement, right? Like if you're building kind of AI-enabled applications, somehow everyone is building like a chatbot into their documentation at the moment. I saw Stripe has it. I think we had it first.
Yep.
Yeah. So that was a really funny story as well. There was this guy in the community, Greg Richardson, and he was like, "Oh, I've built this like Clippy for Supabase docs. Here's like a prototype." And we looked at it and was like, "Damn, this is really, really awesome." And we're like, "Okay, do you just actually want to build this into the Supabase docs? Like, we just contract you to like build this into the Supabase docs." And he was like, "Yeah, sure." And so he shipped it for the docs. And then we're like, "Okay, actually, we really love working with you. let's just join us to lead like our docs product. And so that's
Wow, that's
how
amazing.
Greg became the head for docs product,
Mhm.
really doing some amazing stuff here. And then eventually we're like, okay, so you might be familiar, there's like some very like specialized vector databases that folks are using to sort of enable this functionality where if you're working with OpenAI or some sort of large language model, what you generally do is you translate something like human language or images or audio into vectors, basically just long arrays of numbers.
Mhm.
So you're translating kind of human context into sort of these machine context, which is just long strings. And then what these vector databases do is they allow you to perform certain operations like I think it's cosine similarity, which allow you to sort of figure out for like two things, how close are they together. And so that is helpful if you're having like a search query and you're like you're looking for how do I build authentication in React.
Mhm.
And then you can look up, okay, where are the relevant pieces of documentation for this question, and then give that to OpenAI to basically generate a response in Markdown. So this kind of how it works. And so it all goes back to kind of these vector operations. So vector similarity search is kind of a big part of it. And there was someone really smart who, again, built an extension for Postgres so that Postgres actually can do all these vector operations. And so we're like, okay, this is awesome. So rather than needing, a separate kind of specialized database, you can actually use Postgres to store both your vector data as well as kind of all your other data. And so we're seeing a lot of kind of AI-enabled applications now being built on Supabase. And so we're like, okay, let's actually make this a toolkit. Sort of, we have some libraries as well. Where I think for Python, for example, a lot of the machine learning community is building with Python. And so, there's a bunch of stuff built in, like actually creating the collection, sort of creating the indexes to kind of make the queries easier. And yeah, I've actually built, I think there's, if you go to Supervised community, you can also see like a bunch of sort of AI related projects recently. I think, so this one like Next.js, OpenAI doc search, you can build kind of your own custom sort of ChatGPT style template. We have like a LangChain chatbot demo as well. And yeah, there's like image similarity and kind of things. Right now, I'm actually doing a government hackathon here in Singapore, and we're doing a project where we're helping the elderly kind of apply for jobs.
Oh, nice.
And like for the elderly, like creating a resume is not so easy for them. And so we're
Yeah.
actually building like a chatbot, like into, currently we're just using Telegram because that's the easiest one to get started, where they can basically just talk about their experience, and then we transcribe it and generate a resume for them.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, so working with like edge functions, database, vector database, OpenAI, and everything. It's pretty neat.
That's really nice, man. And I always love when companies and the communities around them do things like that, right? Like and help out other folks with like the tools that they're creating. It's such a beautiful thing, man. I love it. So for folks that are watching the show and they're like, okay, great, like I'm sold, right? Like I love Superbase. I love what you've been talking about, Thor. I love, some of the other initiatives that you've been doing. I'm ready to get started now. Like I want to dive in and I just want to start building my first Superbase integration, right? Like what do you like how do you recommend folks do that? Like and assume I've never touched Firebase or anything like that before. What would your recommendation be for like, hey, do this to get started and try things out?
Yeah. Yeah, I think if you haven't kind of used any of it before, we do have some really good sort of getting started guides for like different use cases, different frameworks. So yeah, there's like tons of different frameworks in there, and a lot of it is contributed by the community as well, which is really amazing. Like the Svelte community is awesome. Nuxt, Redwood, Angular, Ionic. But yeah, so there's different kind of web app tutorials. So for example, say Next.js, you kind of wanted to learn how to build like a user management, right? Like oftentimes you need something like user management. That's a very good point to get started. If you know you need SaaS already, then jump straight to the subscription payments starter. It actually, someone in the community migrated it to use the new what is it called, app directory, app router. So that was really helpful, kind of. So it's up to date to like Next.js 13, app router, kind of all of that. So yeah, if you want kind of a cutting edge Next.js project to build your SaaS, that's a good starting point there.
Nice. And like you mentioned a little bit earlier in our conversation, like this is not just for JavaScript developers, right? Like this is for anybody. So whether I'm doing .NET or Java or Ruby or Go or Rust or anything like that, like I can use Superbase, right? And I could get things set up and ready to go. And so there's really no limitation from that perspective in terms of like who can get involved with what's happening here.
Yeah, that's very true. And I mean, we have an amazing community that is contributing client libraries for different languages. We even have some, I don't even know what this is, Go.engine GD script, but for some people it might be useful. So that's the amazing thing again with open source and Postgres. Like everyone is rallying around, and like everyone is super helpful. We have a Discord channel as well. I think if you go through our Twitter, you can kind of find all the links. Definitely worthwhile following our Twitter as well. We have some really nice memes every once in a while. Let me see if I can find one. Yeah, there, Supabase really just standing on the shoulders of giants. Postgres.
I love it.
Yeah, so it's funny actually. This is most of the memes is Ant, one of the co-founders. This guy here, and he just kind of has that. It is funny because, like, in order to do developer memes, you need like a very deep knowledge, technical knowledge, but also a certain type of humor. So actually, like making these memes is a pretty tough job.
It's a lot of work,
and it's amazing how he just comes up with those.
That's funny.
I mean, a lot of them are like probably just taken from like
other places.
programmer humor on Reddit or something, but no, some of them are actually quite original. Yeah.
No.
Yeah, and we have a new member on the team as well, Yuri, which is great, and she's in US time zone as well. So that's always been a challenge because I'm in Singapore. We have John over in Australia, and so yeah, time zones are tough, man.
Yeah, they are. And you know what? I think Yuri's in the chat
Yuri.
too.
Yeah, I think so.
So quick shout out to Yuri. Hi, Yuri.
Thanks, Yuri. Yuri's awesome.
That's amazing, man. Well, Thor, like I said, this has been great, man. Thank you so much for coming on. I've definitely learned a lot more about Superbase and what it could do. And actually, while you were talking, I actually went to the website, and it looks like there is a free tier. So for folks that are like, hey, I want to try this out, but I don't want to run it on my machine. I don't want to set it up locally, but I just want to have a hosted instance that I can kind of play around with and try stuff out. Definitely recommend you head over to superbase.com and try out that free tier that they have, so that you could see some of the things that Thor showed us, some of the extensions, the GraphQL support, the Postgres REST thing that he showed us, and then all the other cool things that are inside of it. So hopefully y'all learned something. I thought this was a great conversation. Thor, thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate you. And hopefully, folks, we'll see you again next time. Next time we have Stripe Dev Chats. Okay. Take care, everybody.
Thanks so much for having me.
See you all soon.